Welcome to the first part of the book, Man's Search for Meaning. This is part 1, Experiences in a Concentration Camp. Chapter 1, Part 1, and the first part of the few-parted Chapter 1 of Man's Search for Meaning. Disclaimer: this book does not claim to be an account of facts and events, but of personal experiences. Experiences which millions of prisoners have suffered time and again. It is the inside story of a concentration camp told by one of its survivors. This tale is not concerned with the great horrors which have already been described often enough, though less often believed, but with the multitude of small torments. In other words, it will try to answer this question: how was everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of an average prisoner? Most of the events described here did not take place in the large and famous camps, but in the small ones where most of the real extermination took place. This story is not about the suffering and death of great heroes and martyrs, nor is it about the prominent capos, prisoners who acted as trustees, having special privileges, or well-known prisoners. Thus, it is not so much concerned with the sufferings of the mighty, but with the sacrifices, the crucifixion, and the deaths of the great army of unknown and unrecorded victims. It was these common prisoners who bore no distinguishing marks on their sleeves, whom the capos really despised, while these ordinary prisoners had little or nothing to eat. The capos were never hungry. In fact, many of the capos feared better in camp than they had in their entire lives. Often they were harder on the prisoners than were the guards, and beat them more cruelly than the SS men did. These capos, of course, were chosen only from those prisoners whose characters promised to make them suitable for such procedures, and if they did not comply with what was expected of them, they were immediately demoted. They soon became much like the SS men and the camp wardens, and may be judged on a similar psychological basis. It is easy for the outsider to get the wrong conception of camp life, a conception mingled with sentiment and pity. Little does he know of the hard fight for existence which raged among the prisoners. This was an unrelenting struggle for daily bread and for life itself, for one's own sake or for that of a good friend. Let us take the case of a transport which was officially announced to transfer a certain number of prisoners to another camp, but it was a fairly safe guess that its final destination would be the gas chambers. A selection of sick and feeble prisoners incapable of work would be sent to one of the big central camps which were fitted with gas chambers and crematoriums. The selection process was the signal for a free fight among all the prisoners, or of group against group. All that mattered was that one's own name and that of one's friends were crossed off the list of victims, though everyone knew that for each man saved another victim had to be found. A definite number of prisoners had to go with each transport. It did not really matter which, since each of them was nothing but a number. On their admission to the camp, at least this was the method in Auschwitz, all their documents had been taken from them, together with their other possessions. Each prisoner therefore had an opportunity to claim a fictitious name or a profession, and for various reasons many did this. The authorities were interested only in the captives' numbers. These numbers were often tattooed on their skin and also had to be sewn to a certain spot on trousers, jacket, or coats. Any guard who wanted to make a charge against a prisoner just glanced at his number, and how he dreaded such glances, he never asked for his name. To return to the convoy about to depart, there was neither time nor desire to consider moral or ethical issues. Every man was controlled by one thought only: to keep himself alive for the family waiting for him at home, and to save his friends. With no hesitation, therefore, he would arrange for another prisoner, another number, to take his place in the transport. As I have already mentioned, the process of selecting capos was a negative one. Only the most brutal of the prisoners were chosen for this job, although there were some happy exceptions, but apart from the selection of capos, which was undertaken by the SS, there was a sort of self-selecting process going on the whole time among all of the prisoners. On the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who, after years of taking from camp to camp, had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest and otherwise, even brutal force, theft and betrayal of their friends, in order to save themselves. We who have come back from the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. Many factual accounts about concentration camps are already on record. Here, facts will be significant only as far as they are part of a man's experience. It is the exact nature of these experiences that the following essay will attempt to describe. For those who have been inmates in a camp, it will attempt to explain their experiences in the light of present-day knowledge. And for those who have never been inside, it may help them to comprehend and evolve all to understand the experiences of that only too small percentage of prisoners who survived and who now find it very difficult. These former prisoners often say, "We dislike talking about our experiences. No explanations are needed for those who have been inside, and the others will understand neither how we felt nor how we feel now." To attempt a methodical presentation of the subject is very difficult, as psychology requires a certain scientific detachment, but does a man who makes his observations while he himself is a prisoner process the necessary detachment? Such a detachment is granted to the outsider, but he is too far removed to make any statement of the real value. Only the man inside knows. His judgments may not be objective. His evaluation may be put out of proportion. This is inevitable. An attempt must be made to avoid any personal bias, and that is a real difficulty of a book of this kind. At times, it will be necessary to have the courage to tell of very intimate experiences. I had intended to write this book anonymously, using my prison number only, but when the manuscript was completed, I saw that as an anonymous publication it will lose half of its value, and that I must have the courage to state my convictions openly. I therefore refrained from deleting any of the passages, in spite of an intense dislike of exhibitionism. I shall leave it to others to distill the contents of this book into dry theories. These might become a contribution to the psychology of a prison life, which was investigated after the First World War, and which acquainted us with the syndrome of barbed wire sickness. We are indebted to the Second World War for enriching our knowledge of the psychopathology of the masses. If I may quote a variation of the well-known phrase and title of a book by Liebon, "For the war gave us the war of nerves, and it gave us the concentration camps." As this story is about my experiences as an ordinary prisoner, it is important that I mention, not without pride, that I was not employed as a psychiatrist in the camp, or even as a doctor, except for the last few weeks. A few of my colleagues were lucky enough to be employed in poorly heated first aid posts applying bandages made of scraps of waste paper. But I was number 119104, and most of the time I was digging and laying tracks for railway lines. At one time, my job was to dig a tunnel without help for water main under a road. This feat did not go unrewarded. Just before Christmas 1944, I was presented with a gift of so-called premium coupons. These were issued by the construction firm to which we were practically sold as slaves. The firm paid camp authorities a fixed price per day, per prisoner. The coupons cost the firm 50 pfennigs each and could be exchanged for 6 cigarettes, often weeks later, although they sometimes lost their validity. I became the proud owner of a token worth 12 cigarettes. But more importantly, the cigarettes would be exchanged for 12 soups, and 12 soups were often a very real respite for starvation. The privilege of actually smoking cigarettes was reserved for the capo, who had his short quota of weekly coupons, or possibly for a prisoner who worked as a foreman in a warehouse or workshop and received a few cigarettes in exchange for doing dangerous jobs. The only exceptions to these were only those who had lost the will to live and wanted to enjoy their last days. Thus, when we saw a comrade smoking his own cigarette, we knew he had given up faith in his strength to carry on, and once lost, the will to live seldom returned. When one examines the vast amount of material which has been amassed as a result of many prisoners' observations and experiences, 3 phases of the inmate's mental reactions to camp life become apparent. The period following his admission, the period when he is well entrenched in camp routine, and the period following his release and liberation. The symptom that characterizes the first phase is a shock. Under certain conditions, shock may even precede the prisoner's formal admission to the camp. I shall give as an example the circumstance of my own admission. 1,500 persons had been traveling by train for several days and nights. There were 80 people in each coach. All had to lie on top of their luggages. The few remnants of their personal possessions, carriages were so full that only the top parts of the window were free to let in the grey of dawn. Everyone expected the train to head for some munitions factory in which we would be employed as forced labor. We did not know whether we were still in Silesia or already in Poland. The engine's whistle had an uncanny sound, like a cry for help sent out in commiseration for the unhappy load which it was destined to lead into perdition. Then the train shunted, obviously nearing a main station. Suddenly a cry broke from the ranks of the anxious passengers. "There is a sign, Auschwitz!" Everyone's heart missed a beat at that moment. Auschwitz. The very name stood for all that was as horrible as gas chambers, crematoriums, massacres. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the train moved on as if it wanted to spare its passengers dreadful realization as long as possible. Auschwitz. With the progressive dawn, the outlines of an immense camp became visible. Long stretches of several rows of barbed wire fences, watchtowers, searchlights, and long columns of ragged human figures, grey in the greyness of dawn, trekking along the straight, dissolute roads to what destination we did not know. There were isolated shouts and whistles of command. We did not know their meaning. My imagination led me to see gallows with people dangling on them. I was horrified, but this was just as well, because step by step we had to become accustomed to terrible and immense horror. Eventually we moved into the station. The initial silence was interrupted by shouted commands. We were to hear those rough, shrill tones from then on over and over again, in all camps. Their sound was almost like the last cry of a victim, and yet there was a difference. It had a rasping hoarseness, as if it came from the throat of a man who had to keep shouting like that. A man who was being murdered again and again. The carriage doors were flung open, and a small detachment of prisoners stormed inside. They wore stripped uniforms. Their heads were shaved, but they looked well fed. They spoke in every possible European tongue, and all with a certain amount of humor, which sounded grotesque under the circumstances. Like a drowning man, clutching a straw, my inborn optimism, which has often controlled my feeling even in the most desperate situations, clung to this thought. These prisoners look quite well. They seem to be in good spirits and even laugh. Who knows? I might manage to share their favorable position. In psychiatry, there is a certain condition known as delusion of reprieve. The condemned man, immediately before his execution, gets the illusion that he might be reprieved at the last minute. We too clung to shreds of hope and believed to the last moment that it would not be so bad. Just the sight of the red cheeks and round faces of those prisoners was a great encouragement. Little did we know that they formed a special chosen elite who for years had been the receiving squad for new transports as they rolled into the station day after day. 1,500 captives were cooped up in a shed built to accommodate probably 200 at the most. We were cold and hungry, and there was not enough room for everyone to squat on bare ground, let alone to lie down. 1 5-ounce piece of bread was our only food in 4 days. Yet I heard the senior prisoners in charge of the shed bargain with one of the members of receiving party about the tie pin made of platinum and diamonds. Most of the profits would eventually be traded for liquor, schnapps. I do not remember anymore just how many thousands of marks were needed to purchase the quantity of schnapps required for a gay evening. But I do know that those long-term prisoners needed schnapps. Under such conditions, who could blame them for trying to dope themselves? There was another group of prisoners who got liquor supplied in almost unlimited quantities by the SS. These were the men who were employed in the gas chambers and crematoriums, and who knew very well that one day they would be relieved by a new shift of men, and they would have to leave their enforced role of executioner and become victims themselves. Nearly everyone in our transport lived under the illusion that he would be reprieved, that everyone would yet be well. We did not realize the meaning behind the scene that was to follow presently. We were told to leave our luggage in the train and to fall into 2 lines, women on one side, men on the other. In order to file past the senior SS officer, surprisingly enough, I had the courage to hide my haversack under my coat. My line filed past the officer, man by man. I realized that it would be dangerous if the officer spotted my bag. He would at least knock me down. I knew that from previous experiences. Instinctively, I straightened on approaching the professor so that he would not notice my heavy load. Then I was face to face with him. He was a tall man who looked slim and fit in his spotless uniform. What a contrast to us, who were untidy and grimy after our long journey. He had assumed an attitude of careless ease, supporting his right elbow with his left hand. His right hand was lifted, and with a forefinger of hand he pointed very leisurely to the right or to the left. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movements of a finger, pointing now to the right and now to the left, but far more frequently to the left. It was my turn. Somebody whispered to me that to be sent to the right side would mean work the way to the left, being for the sick and those incapable of work, who would be sent to the special camp. I just waited for things to get their course, the first of many such times to come. My haversack weighed me down a bit to the left, but I made an effort to walk upright. The SS man looked me over, appeared to hesitate, then put both his hands on my shoulder. I tried very hard to look smart, and he turned my shoulders very slowly until I faced right and then moved over to that side. The significance of the finger game was explained to us in the evening. It was a first selection, the first verdict made on our existence or non-existence. For the great majority of our transport, about 90%, it meant death. Their sentence was carried out within the next few hours. Those who were sent to the left were marched from the station straight to the crematorium. This building, as I was told by someone who worked there, had the word bath written over its doors in several European languages. On entering, each prisoner was handed a piece of soap, and then, but mercifully, I don't need to describe the events which followed. Many accounts have been written about this horror. We who were saved, the minority of our transport, found out the truth in the evening. I inquired my prisoners who had been there for some time where my colleague and my friend P had been sent. Was he sent to the left side? Yes, I replied. Then you can see him there. Where? A hand pointed to the chimney a few hundred yards off, which was sending a column of flame into the grey sky of Poland. It dissolved into a sinister cloud of smoke. That is where your friend is, floating up to heaven, was the answer. But I still did not answer until the truth was explained to me in plain words. But I'm telling things out of their turn. From the psychological point of view, we had a long, long way in front of us from the break of that dawn at the station until our first night's rest at the camp. Escorted by SS guards with loaded guns, we were made to run from the station to the cleansing station. For those of us who had passed the first selection, this was a real bath. Again, our illusion of reprieve found confirmation. The SS men seemed almost charming. Soon we found out their reason. They were nice to us as long as they saw watches on our wrist and could persuade us in well-meaning tones to hand them over. Would we not have to hand over all our possessions anyway, and why should not that relatively nice person have the watch? Maybe one day he could have done one of a good turn. We waited in the shed, which seemed to be the anteroom to the disinfecting chamber. SS men appeared and spread out blankets in which we had to throw all our possessions, all our watches and jewelry. There were still naive prisoners among us who asked the amusement of the more seasoned ones who were there as helpers if they could not keep a wedding ring, a medal, or a good luck piece. No one could yet grasp the fact that everything would be taken away. I tried to take one of the old prisoners into my confidence. Approaching him furtively, I pointed to the roll of paper in the inner pocket of my coat and said, "Look, this is the manuscript of a scientific book. I know what you will say, that I should be grateful to escape with my life. That should be all I can expect of fate, but I cannot help myself. I must keep this manuscript at all costs. It contains my life's work. Do you understand that?" Yes, he was beginning to understand. A grin spread slowly over his face. Piteous, then more amused, mocking, insulting, until he bellowed one word at me in answer to my question, a word that was ever present in the vocabulary of the camp inmates. Shit! At that moment, I saw the plain truth, and did that mark the culminating point of the first phase of my psychological reaction. I struck out of my whole former life. Suddenly there was a stir among my fellow travelers, who had been standing about with pale, frightened faces. Helplessly debating again, we heard the hoarsely shouted commands. We were driven with blows into the immediate anteroom of Bath. They were assembled around an SS man who waited until we had arrived. Then he said, "I will give you 2 minutes, and I shall time you by my watch. In these 2 minutes you will get fully undressed and drop everything on the floor where you are standing. You will take nothing with you except your shoes, your belt, or suspenders, and possibly a truss. I'm starting to count now." With unthinkable haste, people tore off their clothes. As the time grew shorter, they became increasingly nervous and pulled clumsily at their underbelts, belts, and shoelaces. Next, we were herded into another room to be shaved. Not only our heads were shorn, but not a hair was left on our entire bodies. Down the showers, where we lined up again, we hardly recognized each other. But with great relief, some people noted that real water dripped from the sprays. While we were waiting for a shower, our nakedness was brought home to us. We really had nothing now except our bare bodies, even minus hair. All we possessed literally was our naked existence. What there remained for us as a material link with our former lives. For me, there were my glasses and my belt. The latter I had to exchange later on for a piece of bread. There was an extra bit of excitement in store for the owners of trusses. Where our shoes were concerned, matters were not so simple. Although we were supposed to keep them, those had fairly decent pairs had to give them up after all, and we were given in exchange shoes that did not fit. In for real trouble were those prisoners who had followed the apparently well-meant advice given in the anteroom of the senior prisoners and had shortened their shack boots by cutting the tops off, then smearing soap on the cut edges of the hide sabotage. The SS men seemed to have waited for just that. All suspected of this crime had to go into a small adjoining room. After a time, we again heard the lashings of the strap and the screams of torture man. This time, it lasted for quite a while. Thus the illusions some of us still heard were destroyed one by one, and then quite unexpectedly, most of us were overcome by a grim sense of humor. We knew that we had nothing to lose except our so ridiculously naked lives. When the showers started to run, we all tried very hard to make fun, both about ourselves and about each other. After all, real water did flow from the sprays. Apart from the strange kind of humor, another sensation seized us. Curiosity. I have experienced this kind of curiosity before, as a fundamental reaction towards certain strange circumstances. Cold curiosity predominated even in Auschwitz, somehow detaching the mind from its surroundings, which came to be regarded with a kind of objectivity. At that time, one cultivated this state of mind as a means of protection. We were anxious to know what happens next, and what would be the consequence, for example, for us standing in the open air in the chill of a late autumn, stark naked and still wet from the showers. The next few days, our curiosity evolved into surprise. Surprise that we did not catch cold. There were many similar surprises in store for new arrivals. The medical man among us learned first of all, textbooks tell lies. So it is said that man cannot exist without sleep for more than a stated number of hours. Quite wrong. I had been convinced that there were certain things I just could not do. I could not sleep without this, or I could not live with that or the other. The first night in Auschwitz, we slept in beds which were constructed in tiers. On each tier, measuring about 6.5 to 8 feet, slept 9 men, directly on the boards. 2 blankets were shared by each 9 men. We could of course lie only on our sides, crowded and huddled against each other, which had some advantages because of the bitter cold. Though it was forbidden to take shoes up to the bunks, some people did use them secretly as pillows in spite of the fact that they were caked with mud. Otherwise, one's head had to rest on the crook of an almost dislocated arm. I would like to mention a few similar surprises on how much we could endure. We were not able to clean our teeth, and yet, in spite of that and a severe vitamin deficiency, we had healthier gums than ever before. We had to wear the same shirts for half a year until they had lost all appearance of being shirts. For days we were unable to wash, even partially, because of frozen water pipes, and yet the sores and abrasions on hands which were dirty from work in the soil did not subside, that is, unless there was frostbite. Or for instance, a light sleeper who used to be disturbed by the slightest noise in the next room now found himself lying pressed against a comrade who snorted loudly a few inches from his ear and yet slept quite soundly through the noise. If someone now asked us of the truth of Dostoevsky's statement that flatly defines man as being who can get used to anything, we could reply, yes, a man can get used to anything, but do not ask how. But our psychological investigations have not taken us that far yet. Neither had we prisoners reached that point. We were still in the first phase of our psychological reactions. The thought of suicide was entertained by nearly everyone, if only for a brief time. It was born of the hopelessness of the situation, the constant danger of death looming over us daily and hourly, and the closeness of deaths suffered by many of the others. From personal convictions, which will be mentioned later, I made myself a firm promise on my first evening in camp that I would not run into the wire. This was a phrase used in camp to describe the most popular method of suicide, touching the electrically charged barbed wire fence. It was not entirely difficult for me to make this decision. There was little point in committing suicide, since for the average inmate, life expectation calculating objectively and counting all likely chances was very poor. He could not, with any assurance, expect to be among the small percentage of men who survived all these selections. The prisoner of Auschwitz, in the first phase of shock, did not fear death. Even the gas chambers lost their horrors for him after the first few days. After all, they sparked him the act of committing suicide. Friends whom I have met later have told me that I was not one of those whom the shock of admission greatly depressed. I only smiled, and quite sincerely, when the following episode occurred the morning after our first night in Auschwitz. In spite of strict orders not to leave our blocks, a colleague of mine who had arrived in Auschwitz several weeks previously smuggled himself into our hut. He wanted to calm and comfort us and tell us a few things. He had become so thin that at first we did not recognize him. With a show of good humor and a devil-may-care attitude, he gave us a few hurry tips. Don't be afraid. Don't fear. The selections, Dr. M, the SS Medical Chief, has a soft spot for doctors. This was wrong. My friend's kindly words were misleading. One prisoner, the doctor of a block of huts, and a man of some 6 years old, told me how he had treated Dr. M to let of his son, who was destined for gas Dr. M. Dr. M coldly refused this, but one thing I beg of you, he continued, shave daily, if at all possible, even if you have to use a piece of glass to it. Even if you have to give your last piece of bread for it, you will look younger and the scrapping will make your cheeks look ruddier. If you want to stay alive, there's only one way, look fit for work. If you even limp, because let's just say you have a small blister on your heel, and as SS man spots this, he will wave you aside and the next day you're sure to be gassed. Do you know what we mean by a Muslim? A man who looks miserable, down and out, sick and emaciated, and who cannot manage hard physical labor and no longer. This is a Muslim. Sooner or later, usually sooner, every Muslim goes to the gas chambers. Therefore, remember, shave, stand and walk sparely, then you don't need to be afraid of gas. All of you standing here, even if you have only been here 24 hours, you need not fear gas, except perhaps you. And then he pointed to me and said, I hope you don't mind my telling you, Frankl. To the others he repeated, of all of you, he is the only one who must fear the next election. So don't worry. And I smiled. I'm now convinced that anyone in my place on that day would have done the same. I think it was a Lessing who once said, there are things which must cause you to lose your reason, or you have none to lose. An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Even we psychiatrists expect the reactions of a man to an abnormal situation, such as being committed to an asylum, to be abnormal in proportion to the degree of his normality. The reaction of a man to his admission to a concentration camp also represents an abnormal state of mind, but judged objectively, it is a normal and, as will be shown later, typical reason to the given circumstances. These reactions, as I have described them, began to change in a few days. The prisoners passed from the first to the second phase, the phase of relative apathy, in which he achieved a kind of emotional death. Apart from the already described reactions, the newly arrived prisoner experienced the tortures of other most painful emotions, all of which he tried to deaden. First of all, there was his boundless longing for his home and his family. This often could become so acute that he felt himself consumed by longing. Then there was disgust with all the ugliness which surrounded him, even in its mere external force. Most of the prisoners were given a uniform of rags which would have made the scarecrow elegant by comparison. Between the huts in the camp lay pure filth, and the more one worked to clear it away, the more one had to come in contact with it. It was a favorite practice to detail a new arrival to a work group whose job was to clean the latrines and remove the sewage. If, as usually happened, some of the excrement splashed into his face during its transport over bumpy fields, any sign of disgust by the prisoner or any attempt to wipe off the filth would only be punished with a blow from a capo. And thus, the mortification of normal reactions was hastened. At first, the prisoner looked away if he saw the punishment parades of another group. He could not bear to see fellow prisoners march up and down for hours in the mire, their movements directed by blows. Days or weeks later, things changed. Early in the morning, when it was still dark, the prisoner stood in front of the gate with his detachment ready to march. He heard a scream and saw how a comrade was knocked down, pulled to his feet again, and knocked down once more. And why? He was feverish, but had reported to sick bay at an improper time. He was being punished for this irregular attempt to be relieved of his duties. But the prisoner who had passed into the second stage of his psychological reactions did not avert his eyes anymore. By then his feelings were blunted and he watched unmoved. Another example, he found himself waiting at sick bay, hoping to be granted 2 days of light work instead of the camp because of injuries or perhaps edema or fever. He stood unmoved while a 12-year-old boy was carried in who had been forced to stand at attention for hours in the store or to work outside with his bare feet because there were no shoes for him in the camp. His toes had become frostbitten and the doctor on duty picked up the black gangrenous stumps with tweezer. one by one. Disgust, horror, and pity are emotions that our spectator could not really feel anymore. The sufferers, the dying and the dead, became such a commonplace sights to him after a few weeks of camp life that they could not move him anymore. I spent some time in a hut for typhus patients who ran very high temperatures and were often delirious, many of them moribund. After one of them had just died, I watched without any emotional upset that scene that followed, which was repeated over and over again with each death. One by one, the prisoners approached the still warm body. One grabbed the remains of a messy meal of potatoes. Another decided that the corpse's wooden shoes were an improvement on his own and exchanged them. A third man did the same with the dead man's coat, and another was glad to be able to secure some, just imagine, genuine string. All this I watched with unconcern. Eventually I asked the nurse to remove the body. When he decided to do so, he took the corpse by its legs, allowing it to drop into the small corridor between the two rows of board, which were the beds for 50 typhus patients, and dragged it across the bumpy earthen floor toward the door. The 2 steps which led up into the open air always constituted a problem for us since we were exhausted from a chronic lack of food. After a few months staying in the camp, we could not walk up those steps, which were each about 6 inches high, without putting our hands on the door jambs to pull ourselves up. The man with the corpse approached the steps. Rarely he dragged himself up, then the body, first the feet, then the trunk, and finally, with an uncanny rattling noise, the head of the corpse bumped up the 2 steps. My place was on the opposite side of the hut, next to the small saw windows, which was built near the floor. While my cold hands clasped a bowl of hot soup from which I sipped greedily, I happened to look out the window. The corpse, which had just been removed, staring at me with glazed eyes. The 2 hours before I had spoken to that man, now I continued sipping my soup. If my lack of emotion had not surprised me from the standpoint of professional interest, I will not remember this incident now, because there was so little feeling involved in it. Apathy, the blunting of the emotions and the feeling that one could not care anymore, were the symptoms arising during the second stage of the prisoner's psychological reactions, and which eventually made him insensitive to the daily hours and beatings. By means of this insensibility, the prisoner soon surrounded himself with a very necessary protective shell. Beatings occurred on the slightest provocations, sometimes for no reason at all. For example, bread was rationed out at our work site and we had to line up for it. Once the man behind me stood off a little to one side, and that lack of symmetry displeased the SS guard. I did not know what was going on in the line behind me, nor in the mind of the SS guard, but suddenly I received 2 sharp blows on my head. Only then did I spot the guard on my side who was using a stick. At such a moment, it is not the physical pain which hurts the most, and this applies to adults as much as to punished children. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. And strangely enough, a blow which does not even find its mark can, under certain circumstances, hurt more than one that finds its mark. Once I was standing on a railway track in a snowstorm. Despite of the weather, our party had to keep on working. I worked quite hard at mending the track with gravel, since that was the only way to keep warm. For only one moment I paused to get my breath and to lean on my shovel. Unfortunately, the guard turned around just then and I thought I was loafing. The pain he caused me was not from my insults or any blows. That guard did not think it worth his while to say anything, not even a swear, word to the ragged, emaciated figure standing before him, which probably reminded him only vaguely of a human form. Instead, he playfully picked up a stone and threw it at me. That to me seemed the way to attract the attention of a beast, to call a domestic animal back to its job, a creature with which you have so little in common that you do not even punish it. The most painful part of beatings is the insult which they imply. At one time we had to carry some long, heavy girders over icy tracks. If one man slipped, he endangered not only himself, but all the others who carried the same burden. An old friend of mine had a congenially dislocated hip. He was glad to be capable of working in spite of it. Since the physically disabled were almost certainly sent to the death, when the selection took place, he limped over the track with an especially heavy girder, and seemed about to fall and drag the others with him. As yet, I was not carrying a thing. I was immediately hit on the back, rudely reprimanded, and ordered to return to my place. A few minutes previously, the same guard who struck me had told us deprecatory that we pigs lack the spirit of comradeship. Another time in the forest, with a temperature at 2 Fahrenheit, we began to dig up the topsoil. which was frozen hard in order to lay water pipes. But then I had grown rather weak physically. Along came a foreman with chubby rosy cheeks. His face definitely reminded me of a pig's head. Then he began, "You pig, I've been watching you the whole time. I'll teach you to work yet. Wait till you dig dirt with your feet. You'll die like an animal. In 2 days I'll finish you off. You've never done a stroke of work in your life. What were you, swine? A businessman?" I was past caring, but I had to take his threat of killing me seriously, so I straightened up and looked him directly in the eye. "I was a doctor. A specialist." "What? Doctor? I bet you get a lot of money out of people, huh?" As it happens, I did most of my work for no money at all, in clinics for the poor. But now I had said too much. He threw himself on me and knocked me down, shouting like a madman. I can no longer remember what he shouted. I want to show with this apparently trivial story that there are moments when indignation can rouse even a seemingly hardened prisoner. Indignation not about cruelty or pain, but about the insult connected with it. That time blood rushed to my head because I had to listen to a man judge my life who had so little idea of it. A man, I must confess the following remark, which I made to my fellow prisoners after the receipt, afforded me childish relief, who looked so vulgar and brutal that the nurse in the outpatient ward in my hospital would not even have admitted him into the waiting room. Fortunately, the capo in my working party was obligated to me. He had taken a liking to me because I listened to his love stories and matrimonial troubles, which he poured out during the long marches to our worksite. I had made an impression on him with my diagnosis of a character and with my psychotherapeutic advice. After that, he was grateful, and this had already been of value to me. On several previous occasions, he had reserved a place for me next to usually consisted of 280 men. That favor was important. We had to line up early in the morning while it was still dark. Everybody was afraid of being late and of having to stand in the back rows. If men were required for an unpleasant and disliked job, the senior capo appeared and usually collected the man he needed from the back roads. These men had to march away to another especially dreaded kind of work under the command of strange guards. However, as long as my capo felt the need of pouring out his heart, this could not happen to me. I had a guaranteed place of honor next to him. But there was another advantage too. Like nearly all the capo inmates, I was suffering from edema. My legs were so swollen and the skin on them so tightly stretched that I could scarcely bend my knees. I had to leave my shoes unlaced in order to make them fit my swollen feet. There would not have been space for socks even if I had had any. So my partly bare feet were always wet and my shoes always full of snow. This of course caused frostbite and chilblains. Every single step became real torture. Clumps of ice formed on our shoes during our marches over snow-covered fields. Over and again men sleep, and those following behind stumbled on top of them. Then the column would stop for a moment, but not for a long one. One of the guards soon took action and worked over the men with the butt of his rifle to make them get up quickly. The more to the front of the column you were, the less you often were disturbed by having to stop and then to make up for lost time by running on your painful feet. I was very happy to be personally appointed physician to His Honor the Capo and to march in the first row at an even pace. As an additional payment for my services, I could be sure that as long as soup was being dealt at lunchtime at our worksite, he would, when my turn came, dip the ladle right to the bottom of the vat and fish out a few peas. This capo, a former army officer, even had the courage to whisper to the foreman, whom I had quarreled with, that he knew me to be an unusually good worker. That didn't help matters, but he nevertheless managed to save my life. The day after the episode with the foreman, he smuggled me into another work party. There were foremen who felt sorry for us and who did their best to ease our situation, at least at the building site. But even they kept on reminding us that an ordinary laborer did several times as much work as we did, and in a shorter time, but they didn't see the reason if they were told that a normal workman did not live on 10 to 10.5 ounces of bread and 1 1/3 of pints of thin soup per day, that a normal laborer did not live under the mental stress we had to submit to, not having news of our families would either been sent to another camp or gassed right away, that a normal workman was not threatened by death continuously, daily and hourly. I even allowed myself to say once to a kindly foreman, "If you could learn from me how to do a brain operation in as short as time as I am learning this road work from you, I would have great respect for you." And then he grinned. Apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. Reality dimmed and all efforts and all emotions were centered on the one task, which was preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow. It was typical to hear prisoners, while they were being herded back to camp from their work sites in the evening, sigh relief and say, "Well, another day is over." It can be readily understood that such a state of strain, coupled with the constant necessity of concentrating on the task of staying alive, forced the prisoners' inner life down to a primitive level. Several of my colleagues in the camp who were trained in psychoanalysis often spoke of a regression in the camp inmate, a retreat to a more primitive form of mental life. What did the prisoner dream about most frequently? Of bread, cake, cigarettes, and a nice warm bath. The lack of having these simple desires satisfied led him to seek wish fulfillment in dreams. Whether these dreams did any good in another matter, the dreamer had to wake from them to the reality of camp life and to the terrible contrast between that and his dream illusions. I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of fellow prisoners who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare, since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffered from fearful dreams or delirium. I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly I drew back the hand, which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him. Because of the high degree of the undernourishment which the prisoners suffered, it was natural that the desire for food was a major primitive stake around which mental life centered. One fellow would ask another working next to him in the ditch what his favorite dishes were. Then they would exchange recipes and plan the menu for the day, when they would have a reunion the day in the distant future, when they would be liberated and returned home. They would go on and on, picturing it all in detail until suddenly a warning was passed down the trench, usually in the form of a special password and number. "The guard is coming." I always regarded the discussions about food as dangerous. It is not wrong to provoke the organism with such detailed and effective pictures of delicacies when it has somehow managed to adapt itself to extremely small rations. And low calories? Though it may afford momentary psychological relief, it is an illusion which psychologically surely must not be a danger